Learn English through story. The dance of desire. The music throbbed like a heartbeat through the grand ballroom, each note curling around the dancers like invisible silk. Chandeliers gleamed above, their golden glow casting intricate shadows over the polished marble floor. It was an evening of elegance, a night where whispered secrets mingled with laughter, and unspoken desires danced in the spaces between bodies. Isabella Montclair stood near the edge of the floor, her hands clasped before her, her dark eyes scanning the swirling figures. She had spent years mastering every movement, learning to turn her body into poetry. Yet tonight, the dance was different. It was no longer simply about grace and skill, it was about power, temptation, and the dangerous lure of what she could not have. Sebastian Devereaux had not been invited. He never was. And yet, he was here, standing just beyond the shifting tide of dancers, watching her. His presence was like a flame in a darkened room, impossible to ignore. His tailored black suit clung to his form, the crisp white of his shirt stark against the midnight fabric. He was everything she had tried to forget, and yet, in this moment, she knew she had never truly let him go. She should have turned away, should have pretended not to see him. But when his hand lifted, palm up, fingers beckoning, she stepped forward before she could stop herself. Their fingers met, and a spark jolted up her arm. The music slowed, as if the world had bent itself to accommodate them. His fingers tightened around hers, guiding her into the dance. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice low, breathless. "And yet, here I am," he murmured, his lips curving into a knowing smile. He led her into a slow turn, the fabric of her gown whispering against the floor. The warmth of his hand at her waist sent shivers down her spine, a reminder of a past neither of them dared to acknowledge aloud. "Someone will see us," she said. "Let them," he replied. The world beyond the dance ceased to exist. The only reality was the space between them, the tension that crackled with every movement. Desire, rich and intoxicating, pulsed in the silence between words, in the slide of his fingers along her spine, in the way his breath fanned against her skin, when he leaned in just close enough to make her forget propriety. But desire was never without consequence. As the final note of the song hung in the air, the spell shattered. A murmur spread through the crowd. A figure stood at the edge of the ballroom, watching. Isabella's stomach turned to ice. Her fiancé, a man she did not love, a man bound to her by duty, by family, by an arrangement she had never questioned until now. The dance had ended, but the real battle had just begun. The moment the music faded, Isabella felt the weight of reality crashing back upon her. She could still feel the warmth of Sebastian's hand, the lingering pressure against her back where his fingers had traced an unspoken promise. But as she turned her head, she met the piercing gaze of Alexander Remington, the man she was engaged to marry. His expression was unreadable, calm, composed, but there was something cold in the way his lips pressed into a thin line. He did not storm across the ballroom, did not demand an explanation. That was not his way. Alexander was a man of quiet control, of carefully measured words, and that, more than anything, sent a shiver of dread through Isabella's chest. Sebastian's hand tightened around hers for a fleeting second before releasing her. He had seen Alexander, too. He knew what this meant. Without another word, Sebastian stepped back into the crowd, disappearing into the sea of silks and suits, leaving Isabella standing alone. The moment was over, and now she had to face what came next. Alexander approached with slow, deliberate steps. He extended a gloved hand. "Shall we dance?" There was no warmth in his voice, only the expectation of obedience. Isabella hesitated for the briefest of moments before placing her hand in his. His grip was firm, but not cruel. He led her to the center of the floor, or just as the orchestra struck up a new waltz. They moved together, perfectly in sync, a picture of elegance and discipline. But Isabella felt none of the fire, none of the breathless exhilaration she had experienced just moments ago. Dancing with Alexander was like moving through a dream she had long since outgrown. "You should be more careful," Alexander murmured. his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I don't know what you mean," Isabella replied, keeping her expression serene even as her heart pounded in her chest. He let out a quiet chuckle, though there was no amusement in it. "You underestimate me, Isabella. Do you think I didn't see? Do you think no one else did?" Her throat tightened. "It was just a dance." "Perhaps." He spun her effortlessly, his grip tightening ever so slightly. "But the way you looked at him, that was not just a dance." A flicker of something dark passed through his eyes, and Isabella knew then that she had made a mistake. Not in dancing with Sebastian, that she had done willingly, recklessly, but in thinking she could keep her desires hidden. Alexander leaned in, his breath brushing against her ear. "We're to be married in 3 weeks. You will not embarrass me again." A chill settled in her bones. She had always known her engagement to Alexander was more arrangement than romance. Their families had decided it long before. She had been old enough to understand what love truly was, but she had never feared him, not until now. As the waltz ended, Alexander released her hand and inclined his head. "Smile, my dear," he said softly. "Everyone is watching." But reality was not so kind. A voice called her name, sharp and commanding. Isabella jerked her hand away, rising to her feet as Alexander emerged from the garden path. His gaze flickered between her and Sebastian, and though his expression remained calm, she saw the cold calculation in his eyes. "I was not aware we were expecting company," Alexander said, his tone polite but edged with steel. Sebastian rose to his full height, unflinching. "I was merely passing through." Alexander's smile did not reach his eyes. "And now you may continue on your way." A silent challenge passed between the two men, and Isabella felt herself caught between them, between two forces pulling her in opposite directions. Sebastian hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Of course." He turned to Isabella, his gaze lingering. "Goodbye, Isabella." The finality of his words sent a sharp pain through her chest. She watched him go, her heart screaming for her to call him back. But she remained silent. Alexander stepped beside her, offering his arm. "Shall we return to the house?" Isabella hesitated before placing her hand on his arm, feeling the weight of her choice settle upon her. As they walked back toward the estate, she knew one thing for certain. The dance of desire was far from over. That night, Isabella sat at her vanity, her reflection bathed in the soft glow of candlelight. Her hair cascaded over her shoulders, free of pins and jewels, a stark contrast to the perfectly composed image she presented to the world each day. She traced a fingertip over her lips, still haunted by the memory of Sebastian's voice, the quiet intensity of his touch. He had asked her to leave with him, and she had said nothing. Her mind told her she had done the right thing, that duty must always come before desire, but her heart ached with something she dared not name. A soft knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting one of the maids. Instead, Alexander stepped inside, his presence as commanding as ever. He closed the door behind him, his gaze unreadable as he studied her. "You should not be in my chambers," Isabella said, keeping her voice steady even as her pulse quickened. "I had to see you," he said simply. She turned away, pretending to adjust a bottle of perfume on the vanity. "What is it?" Alexander moved behind her, his hands resting lightly on the back of her chair. "You've been distant, Isabella." "I've been preoccupied." "With what?" His voice was low, measured, but she could feel the weight of his suspicion pressing against her. She met his gaze in the mirror. "Our wedding? It is only weeks away." A slow smile curved his lips. "Yes, it is." He reached out, running a finger along her bare shoulder, his touch deceptively gentle. "I trust there will be no further distractions." She stiffened, the meaning behind his words clear. He was warning her. Sebastian had been a mistake in Alexander's eyes, a moment of foolishness that would not be tolerated again. Isabella turned in her chair to face him, her chin lifting ever so slightly. "You do not own me, Alexander." His expression darkened, though his smile remained. No, but soon, we will be bound in ways that cannot be undone. She felt the unspoken thread in his words, the reminder of the life that awaited her, life of control, of expectation, of submission. "Good night, Alexander," she said firmly. A long silence stretched between them before he finally inclined his head. "Good night, my love." The words sent a chill through her. As soon as he left, Isabella let out a shaky breath, gripping the edges of her vanity. This was her future, a life of wealth, of status, of quiet suffocation. Unless she dared to change it, unless she was willing to risk everything. But did she have the courage to do so? Or would she let the dance of desire become nothing more than a fleeting memory? The days leading to Isabella's wedding passed in a blur of silken gowns, measured smiles, and whispered congratulations from guests, who saw her union with Alexander as a triumph. They did not see the weight pressing against her ribs, the suffocating dread that wrapped around her tighter than any corset. But Sebastian had seen it, and he was not willing to let her go so easily. On the eve of her wedding, Isabella walked alone through the Montclair Estates gardens, the cool night air brushing against her bare arms. The stars shimmered overhead, indifferent to the turmoil that raged within her. Then, a shadow moved. Her breath caught as Sebastian stepped from the darkness, his gaze locking onto hers. He was dressed in simple riding clothes, his dark hair slightly tousled as if he had ridden through the night just to see her. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, though her feet did not move away. "And yet, here I am," he murmured, echoing the words they had exchanged before. She swallowed hard. "Tomorrow, I am to be married." His jaw clenched. "I know." Silence stretched between them, thick with everything that had been left unsaid. "Say the word, Isabella," Sebastian said, stepping closer. "Tell me to take you away from all of this, and I will." Her heart pounded against her ribs. She had dreamed of this moment, of the possibility of escape. But reality was not so simple. "If I go with you," she whispered, "Alexander will not rest until he finds me." Sebastian reached for her, his fingers grazing her wrist. "Let him try." Her breath hitched. How easy it would be to say yes, to surrender to the pull that had been drawing them together since that first fateful dance. But fear coiled in her stomach. Alexander was not a man who tolerated betrayal. And if she chose Sebastian, it would not be just herself she condemned, it would be him, too. A rustle in the distance made her step back, her heart leaping into her throat. "We cannot," she said, her voice trembling. "If he finds us." "I don't care," Sebastian interrupted, his voice raw with emotion. "I would rather spend one day with you in freedom than a lifetime knowing I let you walk away." Tears burned in her eyes. "You don't understand. He will destroy you. Let me worry about that." But she could not. She took another step back, shaking her head. "It is too late." Sebastian's eyes darkened. "Is it?" A pause, a chance, a single moment where she could reach for the life she truly wanted. Then she turned away. Sebastian inhaled sharply, as if she had struck him. But he did not stop her. As she disappeared into the estate, her heart breaking with every step, she told herself she had done the right thing, that this was the only way. But deep inside, she knew she had just condemned herself to a lifetime of regret. And the dance of desire was far from over. The morning of Isabella's wedding arrived with the golden glow of dawn, filtering through the lace curtains of her chamber. The estate was alive with preparation servants moving swiftly, florists arranging towering bouquets of white roses, guests arriving in elegant carriages. The world around her was celebrating. But Isabella felt like a prisoner walking to the gallows. Her mother, beaming with pride, oversaw the final touches of her bridal gown. The fabric was exquisite, delicate lace overlaying smooth satin, cinched at the waist to perfection. Pearls adorned her throat, a symbol of purity and grace. Everything was as it should be. And yet, when she looked in the mirror, she did not recognize the woman staring back at her. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Her mother turned to one of the maids. "See who it is." The door opened, and a footman entered, bowing slightly. "Miss Montclair, you have a letter." A letter? Her mother frowned. Who would send a letter on her wedding day? But Isabella already knew. Her hands trembled as she took the envelope, its edges slightly crumpled, as if it had been delivered in haste. She broke the seal, unfolding the paper with careful fingers. Asterisk asterisk Isabella, asterisk asterisk. Asterisk asterisk, it is not too late. If you walk down that aisle, you are choosing a life of duty, not one of love. Meet me by the stables before the ceremony. If you come, we leave together. If you don't, I will never ask again. Asterisk asterisk. Asterisk asterisk yours, Sebastian. Asterisk asterisk. Her breath caught. Sebastian was giving her one last chance. One last chance to choose freedom. One last chance to choose him. Her mother peered over her shoulder. Who is it from? Isabella folded the letter quickly. No one. She forced a smile, handing it back to the footman. Burn it. Her mother nodded approvingly. Good girl. Now, let us finish preparing. The guests are waiting. The guests were waiting. Alexander was waiting. And Sebastian. He was waiting, too. The cathedral was breathtaking, vaulted ceilings stretching high above, adorned with gold and stained glass. Hundreds of candles flickered, casting warm light over the sea of guests, who had gathered to witness the grandest wedding of the season. At the altar, Alexander stood waiting, his expression unreadable. The organ music swelled. Isabella stepped into the aisle, her father at her side, her gown trailing behind her like the weight of her fate. Each step felt heavier than the last. She glanced toward the grand entrance of the cathedral, the doors still open, sunlight streaming in. Beyond them lay freedom, uncertainty, passion. Beyond them lay Sebastian. Her heart pounded in her chest. She reached the altar. Alexander extended his hand. The priest began to speak. And in that moment, Isabella knew. This was not her choice. This was her prison. Her lips parted, her voice barely above a whisper. I can't. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Alexander's fingers tightened around hers, his expression remaining eerily composed. What did you say? Isabella took a step back. I can't do this. A murmur spread through the guests like wildfire. Her mother's face drained of colour. Alexander's grip became a vice. You will not embarrass me. Isabella yanked her hand away. I would rather ruin my name than ruin my soul. Before he could react, she turned. And she ran. Gasps turned to shouts as she lifted her gown and fled down the aisle, past the horrified faces of society's elite, past the disapproving glares of her family, past the life that had been chosen for her. She did not stop. Not when her mother called her name in desperation. Not when Alexander's voice rang with quiet fury. Not when the grand doors of the cathedral slammed behind her. She ran through the streets, the weight of her gown slowing her, her heart hammering against her ribs. And then, a horse stood waiting near the edge of the estate. Sebastian? His eyes widened as he saw her, disbelief giving way to something else, something fierce, something filled with hope. You came, he breathed. Tears blurred her vision as she reached for him. I choose you. Without another word, he pulled her into the saddle, his arms securing her against him. And together, they rode. The city disappeared behind them, the expectations of society fading into dust. Isabella did not look back. For the first time in her life, she was not dancing to someone else's tune. She was finally free. The wind whipped against Isabella's face as Sebastian urged the horse forward. The rhythmic pounding of hooves against the dirt road, the only sound in the night. The world blurred past them, rolling hills, shadowed forests. The distant glow of the Montclair estate fading behind them. She clung to Sebastian, her breath unsteady, her heart racing not from fear but from exhilaration. She had done it. She had broken free. But freedom came at a cost. Sebastian rode hard until they reached the edge of the countryside, where a modest inn stood tucked away from the main roads. He pulled the horse to a stop and dismounted, reaching up to help Isabella down. Her legs wobbled as they touched the ground, her body still thrumming with the aftershocks of her decision. Sebastian cupped her face in his hands, his gaze searching hers. Are you all right? She let out a shaky breath. I don't know. He pressed his forehead to hers. Tell me you don't regret it. Her hands gripped his coat, grounding herself. I don't. A slow smile curved his lips, but there was still something guarded in his eyes. We should get inside. It won't be long before they come looking for you. The weight of reality crashed down on her. She had humiliated Alexander in front of all of high society. Her mother would never forgive her. The Montclairs would never welcome her back. And Alexander. A shiver ran down her spine. Sebastian took her hand and led her into the inn, securing them a small room for the night. It was nothing like the grand chambers she had grown up in, just a simple bed, a wooden table, and a single flickering candle. But it was the first place that felt like hers. As she sat on the bed, exhaustion overtaking her, Sebastian knelt before her, taking her hands in his. This won't be easy, Isabella. I know. You've given up everything. She shook her head. No, I've chosen myself. He exhaled, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. We'll leave at first light. I have a friend in the next town who can help us disappear. She nodded, trusting him completely. But deep down, she knew that no matter how far they ran, Alexander would not let her go so easily. And she was right. Back at the Montclair estate, the aftermath of Isabella's escape was nothing short of chaos. Her mother had collapsed into a fit of hysterics, wailing about the disgrace her daughter had brought upon the family. The guests had dispersed, their whispers carrying the scandal through every corner of high society. But Alexander stood in the center of the wreckage, perfectly composed, his hands clasped behind his back as if he were contemplating a business transaction. His father approached cautiously. We can still control the story. We can say she was taken. No, Alexander said, his voice dangerously calm. She chose to leave. His father hesitated. Then perhaps it's best to let her go, to cut our losses. Alexander turned his gaze to the older man, a slow, deliberate smile stretching across his lips. She is mine. A chill settled in the air. I will find her, Alexander continued, his tone eerily casual. And when I do, she will learn that there is no running from me. Morning came too soon. Sebastian woke Isabella just before dawn, helping her into a borrowed cloak to conceal her identity. They moved quickly, mounting the horse and setting off down the quiet road before the world had fully woken. For a few hours, they rode in peace. The countryside stretched endlessly before them, a promise of the new life they were chasing. But as they reached the outskirts of the next town, Sebastian stiffened. Something's wrong, he murmured, pulling the horse to a slow stop. Isabella followed his gaze. Down the road, a group of riders approached. Their uniforms were unmistakable Alexander's men. Her stomach twisted. He's already looking for me, she whispered. Sebastian's grip on the reins tightened. We have to move, now. But before they could turn back, one of the riders spotted them. There they are. A shout rang out, and in an instant, the chase was on. Sebastian urged the horse into a gallop, the wind roaring past them as hooves thundered behind. The road was narrow, lined with dense forest on either side. We won't outrun them, Isabella gasped. Sebastian's jaw clenched. Hold on. He veered off the road, plunging them into the thick trees, branches whipping past as the horse maneuvered through the underbrush. But the riders followed, relentless in their pursuit. A gunshot rang out. The horse reared, nearly throwing them off. Sebastian cursed. We have to go on foot. He helped Isabella down, grabbing her hand as they sprinted deeper into the woods. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, Alexander's men closing in. Isabella's lungs burned. She had never run like this before, never felt the sharp sting of survival cutting into her chest. Then, Sebastian pulled her behind a fallen tree, pressing a finger to his lips. They crouched low, listening as the riders dismounted, their voices carrying through the trees. Find them. Alexander wants her alive. Isabella's blood turned to ice. Sebastian squeezed her hand, his expression grim. They were trapped, and the dance of desire had just become a fight for survival. Isabella pressed herself against the damp earth, her breath shallow as the footsteps of Alexander's men drew closer. The forest was dense, the underbrush thick with the scent of pine and damp leaves, but the sound of snapping twigs and rustling, Foliage betrayed their pursuer's approach. Sebastian's grip on her hand was firm, steady, but she could feel the tension coiling beneath his skin. He was ready to fight if it came to that. One of the men stepped dangerously close to their hiding place. "She can't have gone far," he muttered. "Lord Alexander wants her brought back unharmed." "And the man?" another voice asked. A cruel chuckle. "Lord Alexander wasn't specific. I say, we have a little fun before we kill him." Isabella's stomach turned. The malice in their voices made it clear this was no simple retrieval. This was punishment. Sebastian shifted slightly, his muscles coiled like a predator waiting to strike. But Isabella placed a trembling hand on his arm. They were outnumbered. A fight would mean death. She glanced at the thick brush to their right, where the undergrowth thinned into a ravine. A risky descent, but better than facing Alexander's men head-on. She met Sebastian's gaze and, with the smallest nod, signalled a plan. Silently, they moved. Every step was agony, every rustling leaf a potential betrayal. But luck was on their side. The men were moving in the opposite direction, their voices growing fainter. They reached the edge of the ravine. It wasn't steep, but the wet earth made it treacherous. Sebastian went first, gripping exposed roots to keep from slipping, then reached up for Isabella. She hesitated only a moment before taking his hand, but as she descended, a branch snapped beneath her boot. The noise was deafening in the silence. A shout rang out behind them. They're here." Sebastian yanked her the rest of the way down, pulling her into a sprint. The chase began again, but this time the forest was on their side. The undergrowth grew wilder, making it harder for the men to follow. Isabella's dress tore as she ran, branches clawing at her like desperate hands, but she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Sebastian pulled her toward a fallen tree, where the remnants of an old hunting trail snaked through the woods. "We have to lose them before we reach town," he panted. "They'll be waiting for us there." She nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. But behind them, the sound of pursuit didn't fade. Alexander's men were relentless. And worse Isabella knew Alexander would be, too. Hours later, after winding through the densest parts of the forest, Isabella and Sebastian finally emerged onto an isolated stretch of road. The town lay ahead, its lights flickering in the distance. Sebastian exhaled in relief. "We made it." But Isabella knew better. Alexander would never stop hunting her. This was only the beginning. Back at the Montclair estate, Alexander sat in his study, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. His men had returned empty-handed, and though he was furious, his expression remained composed. His father stood by the fireplace, arms crossed. "She humiliated you." Alexander's lips curved into a slow smile. "She thinks she has won. You should let her go," his father said. "Find another match. This one is." Alexander's gaze snapped to him. "No." A tense silence stretched between them. Then Alexander stood, adjusting the cuffs of his coat. "Isabella belongs to me," he said simply, "and I will remind her of that." His father hesitated. "And if she refuses?" Alexander's smile didn't falter. She won't." As Isabella and Sebastian reached the outskirts of town, they slowed their pace, blending into the shadows. Sebastian led her to a small inn, choosing a back entrance to avoid unwanted attention. Inside, the air was warm, the scent of roasted meat and old wood filling the space. The innkeeper, a grizzled man with knowing eyes, nodded as Sebastian approached. "Friend of yours?" Sebastian inclined his head. "We need a place for the night. No names, no questions." The innkeeper didn't hesitate. "Upstairs, third door on the right." Sebastian pressed a few coins into his hand, then turned to Isabella. "We're safe for now." She let out a shaky breath. "But not for long." Sebastian's jaw tightened. "I won't let him take you." She believed him. But deep inside, she knew the dance of desire was not over. Alexander would come, and when he did, everything would change. The night was restless. Isabella sat by the small window of their room, staring out at the quiet streets below. The town was still, bathed in the soft glow of lanterns, but she couldn't shake the unease settling deep in her bones. Sebastian had fallen into a light sleep, his body tense even in rest. He was exhausted. He had done everything to protect her, but she knew the real danger had not yet begun. Alexander would come. He was a man who did not accept defiance, and she had humiliated him in front of all of high society. He would not let her go, not out of love, not out of devotion, but because she had dared to say no. A chill ran down her spine. She had chosen freedom, but at what cost? Softly, she stood and crossed the room, sitting on the edge of the bed. Sebastian stirred, his eyes opening instantly, his instincts sharp. "You should sleep," she whispered. He sat up, rubbing a hand over his face. "I will when I know you're safe." She swallowed hard. "Will I ever be?" He exhaled, reaching for her hand. "I swear to you, Isabella, I will keep you free of him." She wanted to believe that, but a part of her knew Alexander would not stop. Morning came with a sense of urgency. Sebastian wasted no time securing a carriage. He had contacts in another city, people who could forge new identities, help them disappear completely. It was their best chance. The town was just waking as they stepped outside. The air was crisp, the streets still quiet. But Isabella felt it, the eyes watching her. She tugged Sebastian's sleeve, whispering urgently, "We need to leave. Now." He noticed it too, the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the tension weaving through the morning air. Then, a figure stepped into the street ahead, tall, immaculate, coldly composed. Alexander? Isabella's breath caught. He was here, and he was waiting for her. Sebastian tensed beside her, his hand drifting toward the knife hidden beneath his coat. But Alexander merely smiled. "Good morning, Isabella," he said smoothly, as if they were old friends meeting by chance. She took a step back. His gaze flicked to Sebastian, assessing him with quiet disdain. "I expected more of a challenge," he mused. "You didn't make it very difficult to find you." Sebastian shifted, positioning himself between them. "If you think she's going back with you, you're mistaken." Alexander's expression didn't change. "You misunderstand." His eyes found Isabella's. "She's coming back because she wants to." Isabella's pulse pounded in her ears. "I don't." His smile didn't falter, but there was something darker behind it. "Not yet." Sebastian reached for her hand. "We're leaving." Alexander lifted a single finger, and from the shadows, his men emerged. 4 of them, armed, ready. A trap. Sebastian's grip tightened. Alexander sighed, as if this were all a mild inconvenience. "Isabella, I've been very patient." His voice was gentle, coaxing, but his eyes were ice. "Come with me now, and I won't hurt him." A cold dread seeped into her bones. Sebastian's jaw clenched. "If you touch her..." Alexander didn't even look at him. "You don't matter." Sebastian lunged. A flash of steel. A struggle. Then, a gunshot. The sound ripped through the street, a violent echo in the quiet morning. Sebastian staggered back. Isabella screamed. Blood bloomed across his shirt, his body swaying before crumpling to the ground. "No," she fell to her knees, her hands pressing against the wound, desperate, panicked. "Sebastian, stay with me." His breath was ragged, his grip weak as he reached for her. Alexander sighed. "I warned you." Rage and grief crashed through Isabella in a tidal wave. She spun toward him, fury burning through her tears. "You monster!" He caught her wrist before she could strike him. His grip was firm, unyielding. "Enough." She fought, clawed at him, but it was futile. He was stronger, and she was trapped. He leaned in, his voice a whisper against her ear. "This dance was never yours to lead." Darkness edged her vision. The last thing she saw before the world faded was Sebastian, his blood staining the cobblestone street. And then, nothing. Darkness swallowed Isabella. When she woke, the world felt different, heavy, suffocating. Her wrists ached. A cool breeze ghosted over her skin, and when she opened her eyes, she found herself in a dimly lit carriage. The interior was lavish velvet seats, gold accents, but it was nothing more than a gilded cage. She was moving. Panic shot through her, and she tried to sit up, but something held her in place. Chains. Thin silver cuffs encircled her wrists, connected to a delicate but unbreakable chain fastened to the seat. Her breath came fast, uneven. Then she heard it, the slow, deliberate sound of liquid being poured. Her gaze snapped forward. Alexander sat across from her, completely composed, pouring himself a glass of deep red wine. He glanced up at her, his expression unreadable. "Ah, you're awake." A storm of fury and grief surged through her. She lunged forward, but the chain stopped her, yanking her back into the seat. Alexander barely reacted. He swirled his wine, watching her with quiet amusement. "You always had such spirit, Isabella. Where is Sebastian?" she demanded, her voice shaking. He's alive," Alexander said smoothly. She stilled. "Alive?" "Barely." As if reading her thoughts, Alexander took a slow sip of his wine. "I don't kill without purpose." He was foolish, but not entirely useless. "I left him breathing for now." Rage burned through her veins. "You think this means you've won?" Alexander sighed, setting his glass aside. "Isabella, you still don't understand, do you?" She glared at him, loathing twisting in her gut. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "This was never a battle. There was never a war. You belong to me." A cold shiver ran down her spine. He reached out, brushing a gloved hand over her cheek. "And now, you will learn what that truly means." She jerked away, her chains rattling. His gaze darkened. "Fight all you want. It will only make your surrender more exquisite." Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I will never surrender." Alexander smiled, slow and knowing. "We'll see." The carriage rumbled forward, carrying her deeper into her fate. And the dance of desire had only just begun. The journey stretched endlessly. The carriage rocked gently, the rhythmic clatter of hooves against the road the only sound between them. Isabella kept her gaze fixed on the window, refusing to meet Alexander's piercing stare. Outside, the landscape blurred past rolling fields giving way to dense forest, then to the towering gates of a grand estate. Her stomach twisted at the sight of it. She recognized the place. Montclair Manor, Alexander's home, her prison. The carriage slowed, and her heart pounded as servants rushed to meet them. The door swung open, revealing the vast estate beyond, elegant, pristine, and utterly suffocating. Alexander stepped out first, then turned to her, offering a gloved hand. "Shall we?" She glared at him, making no move to accept. His lips curved in amusement. "Still so stubborn?" Without another word, he reached inside, unfastened the chains from the seat, and tugged her forward. She had no choice but to follow, her wrists still bound. The moment she stepped onto the cobblestone drive, the air seemed to shift. Servants avoided her gaze, their faces blank. Yet she sensed their silent judgment. She wasn't a guest. She was a captive. Alexander led her inside, his grip firm but never cruel. The grand hall of Montclair Manor was just as she remembered: polished marble floors, glittering chandeliers, tapestries that told stories of power and conquest. And at its heart, the man who had stolen her freedom. He guided her up the grand staircase, past rooms she had once wandered freely. Now, every step felt heavier, each door a reminder of the world she no longer controlled. Finally, he stopped before an ornate door and pushed it open. The room beyond was lavish to lavish. A four-poster bed draped in silk, a roaring fireplace, a balcony overlooking the sprawling gardens. It was beautiful, and it was a cage. He unfastened the chains from her wrists, letting them fall to the floor with a soft clatter. "You will stay here," he said simply. "I suggest you make yourself comfortable." Her pulse thundered in her ears. "And if I refuse?" His eyes darkened, a silent warning. Then you will learn the consequences. She lifted her chin, refusing to cower. I am not your property. Alexander stepped closer, the heat of his presence suffocating. No, he murmured. You are something far more precious. His fingers brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, his touch feather light. I will have your devotion, Isabella, he said, his voice a whisper of promise and threat. One way or another. Then, without another word, he turned and left, locking the door behind him. Isabella stood motionless, her breath coming in shallow bursts. She was alone, trapped, and Sebastian was out there, barely clinging to life. Tears stung her eyes, but she swallowed them back. She would not break. Not yet. Because if there was one thing she knew, this dance was not over, and she would find a way to lead it. The night stretched long and cold. Isabella sat by the locked door, her fingers tracing the metal seam where it met the wood. Escape seemed impossible, but she would not accept this fate. Alexander thought he had won. He thought she would surrender, but he didn't know the depth of her resolve. She moved to the balcony, the night wind tangling her hair. Below, the estate stretched into darkness gardens, courtyards, and beyond them, the world she had lost. She could run, if only she had the chance. A knock at the door startled her. She turned just as it creaked open, revealing a familiar figure. Juliet. The maid had served the Montclair family for years, her presence always quiet and efficient. But now there was something else in her expression. Pity. My lady, Juliet murmured, carrying a tray of food. You must eat. Isabella folded her arms. Tell me where Sebastian is. Juliet hesitated. I don't know. You're lying? Juliet's lips pressed into a thin line. I swear, my lady, Lord Alexander had him taken away. The servants are forbidden to speak of it. A fresh wave of fear crashed over Isabella. Taken away? What did that mean? Is he alive? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Juliet hesitated. As far as I know, yes. The breath left Isabella's lungs. He was alive. That meant she had a chance. She straightened. Help me. Juliet's eyes widened. I cannot. You can. Isabella's voice sharpened. You know what he is. You know what he's capable of. Do you truly wish to serve him forever? The maid flinched, glancing toward the door. If I am caught, you won't be, Isabella pressed. Please. Juliet swallowed hard. What do you need? Hope flickered in Isabella's chest. A way out, she whispered. Juliet's expression wavered fear, uncertainty. But then she nodded. I will return before dawn. With that, she slipped from the room, locking the door behind her. Isabella's hands clenched into fists. She was not powerless. Not yet. Alexander stood in his study, staring into the fire. A glass of brandy sat untouched beside him. She hated him. He had seen it in her eyes, felt it in the way she recoiled from his touch. And yet, he could not let her go. She belonged here, with him. A knock at the door. Enter. A guard stepped in. Lord Alexander, the prisoner has been moved as ordered. He's weak, but alive. Alexander didn't turn. Good, and sure he does not die, yet. Yes, my lord. The guard left. Alexander exhaled slowly. Isabella would come to understand, one way or another. And if not, he swirled the brandy in his glass, watching the firelight dance across its surface. Then he would break her. Juliet returned just before dawn, as promised. A cloak, a key, directions through the servants' passages. Isabella's heart pounded as she slipped into the dark hallways. Every step measured, every breath quiet. She was close, so close. But freedom would not come easily, because as she reached the last door, a voice stopped her cold. Going somewhere? She turned. Alexander stood in the shadows, watching her with a quiet, knowing smile. A hunter waiting for his prey. Her stomach dropped. The dance was not over, and now she had lost the lead. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. The dim torchlight cast flickering shadows across Alexander's face. But his expression remained unreadable. He had known. Had he been waiting for this? Had he set a trap just to see if she would run? Juliet, standing behind her, froze in terror. Alexander stepped closer, slow and deliberate, like a predator savoring the moment before the kill. "Disobedient," he murmured. "I expected better." Isabella forced herself to meet his gaze. "I will never stop trying to leave." A soft sigh. "I know." His hand moved, faster than she could react. A sharp yank, he seized her wrist, jerking her forward. She gasped, stumbling into his chest. The scent of him smoke, leather, and something richer, darker wrapped around her. She pushed back, but his grip tightened. Juliet whimpered, "My lord, please." Alexander didn't look at her. "Leave us." Juliet hesitated, then turned and fled down the corridor. The door creaked shut behind her, sealing Isabella in with the man who held her fate in his hands. Alexander studied her, his eyes trailing over the cloak she had stolen. "You truly thought you could escape me? I would rather die trying than live as your prisoner." His jaw tightened, but he exhaled slowly, as if reining himself in. "You mistake my patience for weakness," he said softly. Then, without warning, he swept her off her feet. She gasped as he lifted her effortlessly, one arm around her back, the other securing her legs. "Put me down." She struggled, but he carried her as if she weighed nothing, moving through the halls with the unshakable confidence of a man who owned everything in his path. "You were given a room, fine clothes, comfort," he said, his voice eerily calm. "I hoped you would adjust, but you insist on making this difficult." She caught at his shoulder, fury burning in her chest. "You don't own me." He didn't respond. Instead, he carried her past the grand halls of Montclair Manor, deeper into its heart. She realized, with cold horror, where he was taking her. Not back to her chambers. Somewhere worse. The dungeon. The cell was small, lit only by a single flickering candle. The stone walls were damp, the air thick with the scent of earth and iron. Alexander set her down, but when she tried to bolt, he caught her chin between his fingers, tilting her face up to his. His touch was not gentle. "I do not enjoy this, Isabella." His voice was quiet, but laced with warning. "But you will learn." She wrenched free. "I will never belong to you." He exhaled, shaking his head. "No, but you will submit." A shiver crawled down her spine. He turned to leave, his coat sweeping behind him. The heavy door groaned as he pulled it shut. She lunged forward, too late. It slammed. The lock clicked into place. Darkness swallowed her. She pressed against the door, her breath uneven. A prisoner, truly now. Alone. But not broken. Not yet. She turned, her fists clenching. Somewhere out there, Sebastian was still alive. And if she could not escape, then she would find another way to win. Because this dance was far from over, and she refused to be led. Time lost meaning in the darkness. Isabella didn't know if hours or days had passed since Alexander locked her away. The single candle burned low, casting weak, flickering light over the stone walls. Her wrists ached from where she had beaten against the door, but the iron held firm. He wanted her to break, but she wouldn't. Not for him. Not ever. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. She sat up, her pulse quickening. The door creaked open. "Alexander?" He stood at the threshold, framed in the dim light of the hallway. A tray of food rested in his hands, but he made no move to enter. Their eyes met. "Have you learned your lesson?" he asked quietly. Isabella's jaw tightened. "You will have to do more than lock me in a cell to tame me." A flicker of something amusement, frustration, crossed his face. Then, without a word, he set the tray down on the floor or just inside the doorway. The smell of roasted meat and warm bread filled the air, but Isabella didn't move. She would not take his offering. Alexander exhaled through his nose, as if expecting her defiance. Stubbornness will not serve you here. He stepped closer, his presence filling the tiny space. She refused to shrink back. I could keep you here, he murmured. Days, weeks, until you beg me to release you. She lifted her chin. Then you will wait an eternity. A slow smile. Perhaps. His fingers brushed a lock of hair from her face, lingering against her cheek. But why suffer needlessly? She slapped his hand away. His expression didn't change. If anything, he seemed intrigued. You fascinate me, Isabella, he mused. Few dare defy me. Even fewer survive it. A chill ran down her spine. She had seen his cruelty before. She knew what he was capable of. But if he wanted to break her, he would have to try harder. Eat, he commanded, stepping back. Or I will have you fed by force. She glared at him, her silence her only weapon. Alexander sighed. Very well. The door swung shut. The lock clicked. Isabella sat in the darkness once more. Alone. But not beaten. Not yet. Elsewhere, deep within Montclair's walls, Sebastian stirred. Pain. It was the first thing he felt. A deep, raw agony that spread through his ribs, his limbs, his skull. He tried to move, chains rattled. Memory returned in broken flashes. Alexander's men. The fight. Isabella's screams. And now, this. He forced his eyes open. A dimly lit chamber. A heavy wooden chair beneath him. Iron cuffs around his wrists. A man sat across from him, watching. Not Alexander. Another. A guard. A torturer. Sebastian swallowed against the dryness in his throat. Where is she? The man chuckled. Still alive. For now. Sebastian's blood turned to ice. He pulled against the chains, rage overriding pain. If you touch her. The man tilted his head, amused. You are in no position to make threats. Sebastian gritted his teeth. He had to get out. He had to reach her. Because Isabella was strong, but even she had limits. And if Alexander had his way, she would not be the same when he saw her again. If he saw her again, the dance of desire was no longer a game. It was war, and neither Isabella nor Sebastian intended to lose. The candle had long since burned out. Isabella sat curled in the corner of her cell, her body aching from the cold stone floor. Sleep had been impossible. Her mind was a battlefield of memories and strategies, searching for a way out. She was not broken. Not yet. But she would not last forever. The door creaked open. Alexander again. He stepped inside, a lantern in one hand, the other resting lazily at his side. His presence filled the small space, suffocating in its quiet dominance. You look tired, he murmured. Isabella didn't move. She would not show weakness. He crouched before her, setting the lantern down so that the light illuminated his sharp, unreadable features. I've been patient, he said softly. More patient than you deserve. She swallowed the dryness in her throat but said nothing. Alexander studied her for a long moment. Then he reached out, fingers brushing over the sleeve of her dress. A small, thoughtful touch, as if testing something unspoken between them. Isabella recoiled. His hand fell away. You resist because you believe you have a choice, he murmured. But the world outside this manor will never belong to you. If you ran, where would you go? Who would take you in? You have no family left. No power, no protection. Her fists clenched. I had someone. Sebastian? Alexander's expression darkened for the first time. You placed too much faith in a man who failed you. Her pulse pounded. He's still alive. A slow smile. For now. A rush of cold fear shot through her. Alexander saw it. He leaned closer, his voice lowering to a near whisper. Tell me, Isabella, how much suffering would you endure to keep him breathing? She went still. His meaning was clear. If she continued to fight, Sebastian would pay the price. Rage wide with helplessness inside her. He was trapping her in a different kind of cage now, not chains. Not a locked door, but something worse. A choice, or the illusion of one. She forced herself to meet his gaze. You claim you don't want to hurt me. Prove it. His lips curled in amusement. And how would I do that? Let him go. Alexander chuckled. Clever. She swallowed hard. If you have me, you don't need him. A silence stretched between them. Then, after a moment, Alexander stood. I will consider it. He turned toward the door. Eat, he ordered without looking back. You'll need your strength. And then he was gone. The lock clicked, sealing her in once more. Isabella closed her eyes. Sebastian was alive. But for how much longer? Sebastian had lost track of time. The chains bit into his wrists, his body weakened by hunger and pain. But his mind was clear. Escape was not impossible. His captors underestimated him. They saw only the bruises, the broken flesh, the slow, exhausted rise and fall of his chest. But he was watching, waiting, for the right moment. A guard entered, carrying a tray. Sebastian let his head loll forward, feigning exhaustion. The man knelt to place the food down. Closer. Sebastian moved fast, his foot shot out, catching the guard off balance. The tray clattered to the floor. Before the man could react, Sebastian wrenched forward, slamming the chains against his throat. A strangled gasp. A struggle. Then the body went limp. Sebastian didn't hesitate. He searched the unconscious man, his fingers finding the key. With shaking hands, he unlocked the chains. Pain screamed through his limbs as he stood, but he ignored it. He had one chance, and he would not waste it. The storm was coming, and this dance was far from over. Sebastian moved through the dim corridors of Montclair Manor with silent, desperate steps. Every muscle in his body ached from captivity, but he pushed forward. He had no time for weakness. He needed to find Isabella. The weight of urgency pressed against his chest like a vice. He had seen Alexander's cruelty firsthand, knew the darkness that lurked beneath the man's composed exterior. If he reached Isabella too late, no, he couldn't afford those thoughts. A distant sound boots echoing on stone. Guards! Sebastian ducked into the shadows, pressing his body against the cold stone wall as two men passed. Their voices were low, discussing something in hurried tones. Lord Alexander says she will break soon. Sebastian's heart pounded. The second guard snorted. She's lasted longer than most. But she give in. They always do. The first man laughed. Perhaps, but he enjoys the fight. She's different. Their voices faded as they disappeared down the corridor. Sebastian exhaled slowly. She was still resisting. Good, but it also meant she was still in danger. He moved again, faster now, keeping to the edges of the hallways. His mind mapped the manor, recalling every turn, every hidden passage. He had to find her before Alexander did something irreversible. He would not let her suffer alone. Not now. Not ever. Isabella had lost count of how many times the door had opened and closed. Alexander came to see her often. Never with violence. Never with anger. Only quiet words, persuasion, a slow, creeping web of control disguised as patience. You must see it by now, he had murmured just the night before. I am the only one who can protect you. She had ignored him, but the hunger clawing at her stomach, the exhaustion weighing down her limbs, those were harder to ignore. Still, she endured, because Sebastian was out there, and as long as she believed in him, she would not break. A sound at the door. Not Alexander's deliberate footsteps. Something else. Faster. Urgent. Then, the lock clicked. She tensed, expecting another trick. But when the door swung open, her breath caught in her throat. Sebastian? He stood in the doorway, battered but alive, his eyes blazing with urgency. Isabella? Relief flooded her chest. She surged forward, and he caught her in his arms. The warmth of him, the solid weight of his body real. Alive was almost too much to believe. But they had no time. We have to go, he whispered against her hair. She nodded, now. Hand in hand, they ran. Freedom was within reach. But Alexander Montclair did not let go of what he claimed so easily. And this dance was far from over. The corridors of Montclair Manor stretched before them like a maze. But Sebastian had spent weeks studying its passages, and Isabella had spent a lifetime resisting cages. Together, they moved like shadows, slipping past the guards, hearts hammering in unison. Every step toward freedom felt like a defiance against fate itself. They reached the eastern wing, where the manor walls met the edge of the forest. A single-arched doorway led outside. Its iron lock, hanging uselessly open, Sebastian had seen to that. Hope flickered in Isabella's chest. But then, a voice, smooth as silk, sharp as a blade. Leaving so soon? The sound froze them both. Alexander? He stood in the corridor behind them, dressed in midnight black. His presence commanding, dangerous. His expression was calm, but his eyes burned with something darker. Possession. Sebastian moved in front of Isabella instinctively, his body tensed for a fight. Alexander tilted his head, his gaze never leaving hers. I warned you, Isabella. I was patient. I gave you chances. And yet, you insist on running. Isabella stepped forward, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. Because I am not yours to keep. A long silence stretched between them. Then, to her shock, Alexander laughed. A low, quiet chuckle. Sebastian stiffened, his fists clenched. You truly believe you are free, Alexander mused. That out there, he gestured to the open doorway, to the dark expanse of trees beyond. You will find salvation. His voice softened. But tell me, Isabella, what happens when you leave here? When the world reminds you that it is crueler than I've ever been? She held his gaze. Then I will face it. Because I would rather fight for my own life than be a prisoner in yours. A flicker of something disappointment, admiration, crossed his face. Then, with a slow breath, Alexander stepped aside. Sebastian's eyes narrowed. What game is this? Alexander met Isabella's gaze one last time. No game, he murmured. A choice. The weight of those words pressed against her like a final test. But she had already chosen. Taking Sebastian's hand, she stepped past Alexander, past the man who had tried to control her, past the shadows of her captivity and into the open air. The cold wind hit her face, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she breathed freely. They ran, through the trees, past the iron reach of Montclair Manor, into the world that awaited them. And Alexander did not follow, because he had finally understood. A caged bird may sing, but it will never dance. And love, no matter how fiercely it is desired, cannot be forced. Days later, Isabella and Sebastian stood atop a quiet hill, looking down at the land that now belonged to them alone. She turned to him, eyes shining. We made it. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch reverent. We did. There would still be struggles. The world would not always be kind, but they were free. And freedom, above all else, was worth the fight. Because love is not possession. Love is a choice. And Isabella had finally chosen herself. Love cannot be owned or caged. True love is built on freedom, respect, and choice.